أبناء الأونروا في أنشطتها وفاء بالولاية التي منحتها إياها الجمعية العامة. السيد الرئيس، تجدد مملكة البحرين موقفها الثابت والداعي إلى تغليب الحوار والسبل السلمية من أجل إحلال السلام العادل والشامل والدائم في منطقة الشرق الأوسط، بما في ذلك وقف إطلاق النار في قطاع غزة وحل القضية الفلسطينية على أساس حل الدولتين وفقاً لقواعد القانون الدولي وقرارات الشرعية الدولية. وفي هذا السياق أطلقت مملكة البحرين خلال القمة العربية 33 مبادرات من شأنها أن تسهم في خدمة القضايا الجوهرية لاستقرار المنطقة وتنميتها، خاصة الدعوة إلى عقد مؤتمر دولي للسلام في الشرق الأوسط، إلى جانب دعم الاعتراف الكامل بدولة فلسطين وقبول عضويتها في الأمم المتحدة. كما تدعم مملكة البحرين التحالف الدولي لتنفيذ حل الدولتين برئاسة المملكة العربية السعودية الشقيقة. ورحبت مملكة البحرين بالتوصل إلى اتفاق لوقف إطلاق النار في الجمهورية اللبنانية بوساطة من الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وفرنسا، باعتباره خطوة مهمة على طريق خفض التصعيد والتوتر العسكري الإقليمي، مؤكدة على ضرورة التزام كافة الأطراف بوقف فوري وشامل وداعم لإطلاق النار وتطبيق قرار مجلس الأمن الدولي رقم 1701 بكافة بنوده، وبسط سيادة الدولة على كافة الأراضي اللبنانية. وختاما السيد الرئيس، تعيد مملكة البحرين التأكيد على ضرورة تبني مسار موثوق لا رجعة فيه لقيام دولة فلسطينية مستقلة ذات سيادة على حدود 4 يونيو 1967 وعاصمتها القدس الشرقية. وستواصل المملكة دعمها لكافة الجهود الرامية إلى تحقيق السلام الشامل والدائم الذي يضمن الأمن والازدهار لجميع دول المنطقة. وشكرا.
I thank the distinguished representative of Bahrain. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of San Marino.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this emergency special session following the veto cast in the Security Council on 20 November in accordance with General Assembly Resolution 76/262. San Marino thanks the elected 10 Security Council members for drafting a resolution which, if adopted, would have unequivocally demanded the cessation of hostilities through an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire, as well as the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other armed groups since the attacks of 7 October. We deeply regret that the text was vetoed. The Security Council must fulfill its responsibility and take action in order to put an end to the destruction in Gaza. Without a rapid and collective action, civilians will continue to pay the burden of this conflict. San Marino reiterates its call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Mr. President, San Marino also reiterates its condemnation of the horrible terrorist attacks by Hamas on 7 October 2023, calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, and recognizes Israel's right to defend itself in line with international law. We deplore the unacceptable number of civilian casualties, especially women and children in Gaza and the West Bank, as well as the catastrophic levels of hunger and imminent risk of famine caused by the insufficient entry of aid into Gaza following Israel's response to these attacks. Rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access is an obligation under international law. It is essential to ensure urgent humanitarian aid to quickly reach the Palestinian population. In this respect, let me underscore the importance of UNRWA, which provides essential humanitarian assistance to millions of people in Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. San Marino is deeply concerned with the recent developments that would hinder the crucial mandate of UNRWA, and we condemn any action aiming at obstructing strengthen this agency's capacity to fulfill its mandate. Mr. President, we reiterate our call to all parties to comply with their obligation under humanitarian human rights law and international humanitarian law, including the principle of protection of civilians and their infrastructures, of medical facilities, schools, and UN premises. There must be accountability for any violation of international law on all sides. In this respect, we reiterate our full support to the ICC, whose work is crucial in the fight against impunity for genocide and crimes against humanity. Moreover, San Marino highlights the need to fully implement the International Charter of Justice orders. Mr. President, San Marino remains committed to the realization of a lasting and sustainable peace based on a two-state solution under which two states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side in peace and security and mutual recognition. The international community must work together in order to restore hope and security to Israelis and Palestinians through a renewed peace process. In this respect, we welcome the decision of holding an international conference under UN auspices next June. Mr. President, San Marino will vote today in favor of the two resolutions. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of San Marino. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Papua New Guinea.
Mr. President, the spotlight in the General Assembly on the Security Council's mandate continues apace, and rightly so, given the importance of the Council's members to step up to the plate to honor their commitment and obligations to serve the cause of peace and security for all of humanity. Papua New Guinea is well cognizant of the outcome of the Council's meeting last month that necessitated the continuation today of the General Assembly's dialogue. Let me place on record that Papua New Guinea, as a peace-loving country, wishes for peace, security, and stability at all levels, including in the Middle East region, and particularly in Israel and Palestine. The dire humanitarian situation in Palestine is indeed a shared concern for all peace-loving nations and peoples, including my own country, as is the ongoing security concerns not only for Palestinians, but also for the State of Israel. Papua New Guinea notes that all lives matter and needs to be respected and requires an environment of peace and security. Any lasting peace and security for the Israeli-Palestinian situation requires genuine and mutually respectful direct dialogue on all relevant issues by all parties concerned, particularly the Israelis and Palestinians. This includes Israel's right to self-defense as permitted under international law. In our view, rhetoric from any parties that incites harmful emotive tensions must be avoided, as this is unhelpful for finding the much-needed pathway for peace and security to take root. Mr. President, the most recent matter of an American hostage held by Hamas is strongly deplored and condemned. We renew our call on those holding the hostages from Israel and several other countries to release them without any preconditions and without any further delay. The ceasefire call without the release of all the hostages is unhelpful to the situation. In closing, Mr. President, Papua New Guinea wishes to place on record that, though we are a member of the non-aligned movement, we disassociate ourselves from the NAM statement delivered by the delegation of Uganda as the chair of the Coordinating Bureau of the Non-Aligned Movement and the associated co-sponsorship of today's proceedings. We do so because elements contained therein are inconsistent with our national position on the issues raised in the statement and co-sponsorship of this meeting. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Papua New Guinea. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lesotho.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, Lesotho aligns itself with the statement delivered by the Republic of Uganda on behalf of the Non-Aligned Movement at the opening of this session. There is no doubt that the ongoing war in Gaza is one of the most disturbing humanitarian crises recorded in the 21st century. This situation has consequently spawned rippling effects across the region. Despite several calls by the international community for an immediate ceasefire, the war continues unabated. The undue suffering that this conflict has inflicted on women, children, and other vulnerable groups is a total breach of international law and a direct contravention of the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. As a result, we call for an immediate end to this conflict. My delegation is gravely concerned with the challenges facing the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA. While it is our collective effort to resolve the Palestinian plight, there is no justification to restricting UNRWA to fulfill its mandate. Such acts, sadly, will collapse the agency and exacerbate further the already daunting humanitarian crisis in Gaza and other Palestinian occupied territories. UNRWA is a lifeline for Palestinian refugees. Any attempts to stifle it from performing its duties will concomitantly lead to a deprivation of essential services, food, education, medical supplies to the children of Gaza, in direct contravention of the commitments under the Convention of the Rights of the Child, among other international instruments. We will recall that in December 2023, this august body adopted a resolution calling for an immediate and sustained humanitarian truce, leading to a total cessation of hostilities by the protagonists. Furthermore, the General Assembly demanded the unhindered provision of essential aid to civilians in Gaza. However, it is worrisome that today, as we speak, the situation in Gaza and other occupied Palestinian territories has become even more catastrophic, particularly with the current challenges faced by UNRWA. We deplore this situation by recalling that the Security Council adopted its landmark Resolution 2417 in 2018, strongly condemning the use of food insecurity and starvation as a weapon of war. In closing, Mr. President, Lesotho echoes the call by the UN Secretary General to all parties involved in the Palestinian conflict to choose peace over war. We call on all the belligerents to lay down their arms and engage in genuine dialogue. On the other hand, we applaud countries that have to date spared no effort towards finding a mediated solution to this conflict. We continue to call for sustained engagements towards finding a lasting solution which respects the rights and concerns of both parties. My country continues to advocate for a two-state solution which will pave the way for the Israelis and Palestinians to coexist peacefully in line with UN resolutions. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lesotho. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
主席，我们今天在这座大厅里举行紧急特别联大，是由于美国一再独家行使否决，导致安理会陷于瘫痪，始终不能采取必要行动推动加沙停火。美国在巴勒斯坦问题上滥用否决权，完全没有正当理由。为了挽救美国否决造成的恶劣影响，印尼等有关国家向联大提出了2份决议草案，一份要求实现加沙立即无条件持久停火，消除人道准入的障碍；另一份要求以色列 撤销针对联合国近东巴勒斯坦难民救济和工程处的法案，保障工程处正常履职，并呼吁国际社会加大对工程处的支持。两项决议草案代表了国际社会的正义呼声，中方将投赞成票。加沙冲突延宕14个月，加沙被炸成废墟，4万多巴勒斯坦民众被夺去生命，幸存者被剥夺最基本的生存物资，在绝望中挣扎。在这场空前的灾难中，我们看到无差别的狂轰滥炸和对平民生命的漠视达到了骇人听闻的程度。我们看到个别国家对盟友的纵容和袒护达到了毫无底线的程度。我们看到国际法的选择性适用和双重标准达到了前所未有的程度。人们不禁要问：难道联合国成立80年来所确立的规则和体系完全不重要、不管用了吗？难道世界要回到丛林时代吗？我们的回答是：世界不能回到丛林时代，不能让丛林法则成为新常态。我们必须推动实现加沙立即无条件停火。停火是拯救生命、恢复和平的前提。把停火问题同其他问题挂钩，甚至反过来为停火设置前提条件，实际上就是为延续战争开绿灯，就是纵容继续杀戮。我们必须维护国际法的权威，履行国际法义务，不允许例外。以色列作为占领方，必须承担国际人道法义务，切实消除一切人道准入障碍，保证物资在加沙全境有效分发，保障人道机构和人道人员安全。我们特别要支持保障联合国近东巴勒斯坦难民救济和工程处正常开展工作。工程处是地区几百万巴勒斯坦难民的依托，更是加沙民众不可替代的生命线。我们敦促以色列停止对工程处等人道机构的打压限制。我们呼吁传统捐助方继续为工程处提供支持，不要参与对巴勒斯坦人民的集体惩罚。我们必须以最大的紧迫感重振两国方案，实现巴勒斯坦和以色列两个国家比邻而居，共享安全和发展是实现巴以和平的唯一出路。国际社会应该为落实两国方案加大支持，提供保障。当前既要帮助巴勒斯坦增强治理能力，支持巴勒斯坦通过内部协商就加沙的未来安排达成一致，同时要警惕并抵制侵蚀两国方案基础的单边行动，包括进一步扩大约旦河西岸定居点以及吞并西岸的企图。中方支持巴勒斯坦国成为联合国正式会员国，支持举行更大规模、更具权威、更有时效的国际和会，制定落实两国方案的时间表和路线图。中方将继续为早日平息战火、恢复地区和平、实现巴勒斯坦问题全面、公正、持久解决做出不懈努力。谢谢主席。
I thank the distinguished representative of China. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Finland.
Mr. President, Finland is deeply concerned about the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. The destruction is massive and the horrific civilian death toll is further increasing. The entire Palestinian population in northern Gaza is at imminent risk of dying from disease, famine, and violence. The disregard for human life must stop. Finland reiterates its strongest condemnation of the brutal attacks committed by Hamas and other terrorist groups in October last year, and taking of hostages in October. But we have consistently underlined that when exercising the right to self-defense, international and humanitarian law apply fully. Israel must comply with its obligations under international law in all circumstances. An immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire is needed urgently, and all remaining hostages must be immediately and unconditionally released. All parties must fully comply with international law, including international humanitarian law. UNRWA remains the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza. All parties must enable the agency to carry out its mandate as adopted by the General Assembly and its vital services to the civilians in all occupied territories. According to international humanitarian law, all parties to a conflict must allow and facilitate the provision of humanitarian assistance to affected populations. Israel, as the occupying power, has the duty to ensure that the basic needs of the occupied population are met. We call on Israel to enable full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access across the Gaza Strip. Finland's support to rules-based multilateralism with the UN at its core is unwavering. Upholding international law is a shared responsibility of all states. In the midst of an ongoing catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza, a halt to any of the activities of UNRWA would have devastating consequences for the hundreds of thousands of civilians served by it. We urge Israel to ensure that UNRWA is allowed to carry out its crucial work in line with its mandate adopted by the UN General Assembly. Mr. President, all permanent members of the Security Council bear a special responsibility to exercise their veto in accordance with the letter and spirit of the Charter. On November 20th, a permanent member of the Council, the United States, used a veto against the resolution calling for ceasefire and release of hostages in Gaza. The General Assembly may discuss any questions relating to the maintenance of international peace and security brought before it by any member of the United Nations. As the Security Council failed again in acting on a situation urgently threatening international peace and security, the General Assembly must act. The situation in Gaza is too dire for the UN to remain silent. Palestinian civilians have borne the brunt of the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza for over a year. Their suffering must stop. We, as the international community, must bear our responsibility in urging and assisting the parties to end this conflict and set up a credible process towards a negotiated two-state solution, which is the only way to bring a lasting peace and security to the Middle East. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Finland. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Canada.
Président, la position du Canada sur les questions relatives au conflit israélo-palestinien est toujours guidée par notre engagement en faveur d'un cadre qui garantit au mieux la paix et la sécurité pour les Israéliens et les Palestiniens, ainsi que par nos obligations collectives de respecter le droit international. Nous déplorons la perte de vie innocente dans ce conflit et nous reconnaissons l'impact direct que cette situation continue d'avoir sur les pays de la région et d'ailleurs. Tous les peuples, tous les pays ont été profondément traumatisés par cette terrible année de douleur, de perte et de souffrance. Nous devons tous prendre conscience des mesures qui sont essentielles pour établir une paix durable. Le Canada votera aujourd'hui en faveur de ces deux résolutions en raison de la nécessité urgente et croissante de résoudre cette crise. Les votes du Canada aujourd'hui soulignent nos appels à un cessez-le-feu immédiat, à la libération de tous les otages, à l'augmentation de l'aide humanitaire à Gaza et la réaffirmation de notre soutien à l'Office de secours et de travaux des Nations unies pour les réfugiés de Palestine dans le Proche-Orient, UNRWA. Nous ne sommes pas d'accord avec certains éléments inclus dans ces résolutions. Nous continuons de croire que ces résolutions devraient condamner les horribles actes de terreur du Hamas, y compris du 7 octobre, et son utilisation de boucliers humains. Nous aurions également souhaité que l'accent soit davantage mis sur la nécessité pour les parties au conflit de négocier de manière significative un cessez-le-feu immédiat. Le Canada condamne sans équivoque les attaques terroristes du Hamas contre Israël du 7 octobre 2023 et les actes de terreur qui se poursuivent. Nous continuons à demander au Hamas de déposer les armes, de cesser de recourir à la violence et de libérer immédiatement tous les otages et les dépouilles des otages décédés, y compris la dépouille de la citoyenne canadienne Judith Weinstein. Nous sommes satisfaits de voir figurer dans cette résolution sur le cessez-le-feu une demande de libération des otages dont la détention ne peut en aucun cas être maintenue. Meanwhile, Mr. President, we see and feel the terrible damage that is taking place in Gaza, the loss of life, the numbers of those injured. We know that the humanitarian situation is horrific, and it continues to worsen. We mourn all civilians killed since October 7th. The scale of civilian casualties is truly heartbreaking. It is also unacceptable, as all actors must comply with international law. Attacks on humanitarian delivery of food and necessary supplies must also stop. And we need to take note of the serious peace and security situation itself within Gaza when it comes to the delivery of humanitarian services. We have concluded that UNRWA's role in responding to this crisis is crucial. Canada reaffirms its commitment to UNRWA, and we have also recommitted our funding, as in condemned the legislation passed by the Israeli Knesset on October the 28th, which we continue to regret, because we believe that it threatens to prevent UNRWA's vital work in Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, without ensuring a credible and practical alternative. We continue to press Israel not to implement this legislation, to enable the continuation of UNRWA's activities in education, health services, and to work constructively to enable its crucial role in the delivery of humanitarian assistance. UNRWA's efforts to address allegations against its staff and its willingness to pursue and implement reform of internal processes in line with the independent review of April 2024, led by Catherine Colonna, on UNRWA neutrality, these efforts must continue. We call on UNRWA to continue its path of reform as a priority, demonstrating its commitment to the principle of neutrality, and ensure that its activities remain entirely in line with its humanitarian mandate. Canada will continue to actively monitor and support this process of reform and implementation of the Kelowna recommendations. We would ask that anyone and any country with additional information or evidence share this in an open and transparent manner so that it can be dealt with in a proper fashion. Let us be clear that Canada remains opposed to the disproportionate singling out of Israel alone for criticism. We reiterate the importance of a fair-minded approach at the United Nations, and we will not support resolutions that fail to address the complexities of these issues. The Assembly's work in recent months on the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a reminder to all of us that in line with the Charter, discussion of such complex issues is not, in fact, reserved entirely for the Security Council. There are options to enable a broader discussion, particularly when the Council cannot act. As President of ECOSOC, I convened a discussion on Haiti just last month to bring attention to the deteriorating situation there. And I hope that this Assembly will find a way to address crucial issues where we find that the Council is stuck. And stuck it surely is, including on Myanmar, Ukraine, Sudan, Afghanistan, Syria, and many other areas of conflict. As we head into the new year, this Assembly must assume its own responsibilities. Canada remains committed to the two-state solution. We believe that a political solution is absolutely essential in order to get to the roots of this conflict and, in fact, to resolve it. We believe that at a time when the dynamics in the broader region show that conflict management, as opposed to conflict resolution, is not a sustainable path to returning the region to a peaceful and prosperous trajectory, we must all do more within our powers, within our capabilities and capacities, to listen to each other, to understand that there is no hierarchy in suffering, to demonstrate a capacity to show empathy for all those who have suffered and all those who are suffering, to push hard for the principle of accountability under the rule of law, and to do everything we can in our capacity to resolve this terrible conflict. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Canada. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item. The General Assembly has thus concluded the stage of its consideration of Agenda Item 5. The Assembly will resume its consideration of Agenda Item 5, entitled Illegal Israeli Actions in Occupied East Jerusalem and the Rest of the Occupied Palestinian Territory, to take action on two draft resolutions issued as documents A/ES-10/L.32 and A/ES-10/L.33. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland to introduce draft resolution A/ES-10/L.32.
President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. It is an honour for Ireland to introduce a draft resolution entitled Support for the Mandate of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, as contained in document L32, which has been submitted to the General Assembly for adoption in this resumed 10th Emergency Special Session. At the outset, I want to thank all the 50+ Member States who have co-sponsored this resolution. We, the co-sponsors, present this draft resolution at a time of profound challenge to the continuity of UNRWA's operations and its life-saving assistance to millions of Palestine refugees, as well as to an important contribution to regional stability. We present this draft in the context of shocking developments in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and especially in the Gaza Strip over the past 14 months. Our action comes in the wake of appeals for decisive intervention by UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres and UNRWA Commissioner-General Philippe Lazzarini. Earlier this week, the Secretary-General circulated a letter on enabling UNRWA to carry out its activities. This followed an extraordinary letter in October to the President of the General Assembly, in which Commissioner-General Lazzarini warned that the agency was under such physical, political and operational attack, unprecedented in the UN's history, that implementation of its mandate may become impossible without decisive action by this General Assembly. President, this draft resolution is the co-sponsor's response. We appeal to all states and members of the General Assembly to act with urgency and resolve to confirm your support for UNRWA's mandate. This is essential to avoid any interruption or suspension of UNRWA's vital humanitarian and development programmes, including education for hundreds of thousands of children. President, over the past 14 months, UNRWA has faced repeated attacks from Israel. It has been subject to attempts by the Israeli government to dismantle the agency and evict it from its premises in occupied East Jerusalem through the adoption of legislation by the Israeli Knesset. It has faced military attacks on its personnel and facilities, and has been the target of a dangerous campaign of misinformation and disinformation. Commissioner General Lazzarini warned in stark terms that the risk of the agency's collapse threatens the lives and the futures of individuals and communities, the stability of the region, and the integrity of our multilateral system. We were recalled to that earlier this month, the Interagency Standing Committee, the highest level humanitarian coordination forum, called for a halt to the assault on Palestinians in Gaza and on those trying to help them. The committee warned of the disastrous impact of Israel's legislation against UNRWA, stating that, if implemented, such measures would be a catastrophe for the humanitarian response in Gaza, would be diametrically opposed to the UN Charter, and would have potentially dire impacts on the human rights of the millions of Palestinians depending on UNRWA's assistance, in violation of Israel's obligations under international law. They further outlined that there is no alternative to UNRWA. We echo their urgent warnings today. We underscore UNRWA's essential and irreplaceable role as unequivocally reaffirmed in the shared commitments on UNRWA launched in July of this year. UNRWA's mandate is an integral part of the UN's long-standing responsibility on the question of Palestine. It will remain so until a just solution is found, including for the plight of the Palestine refugees in line with Resolution 1943. It must be given the necessary political and financial support, including sustained and predictable funding, to ensure the continuity of its operations in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, without interruption or impediment, in accordance with the mandate conferred by this Assembly. We call on Israel not to implement the recent legislation against UNRWA and to cease all attempts to interfere, obstruct, undermine, dismantle, or spread misinformation or disinformation about the agency. Israel must respect the agency's privileges and immunities as a UN entity, and it must fulfill its international legal obligations, including under international humanitarian law. President, we pay tribute to UNRWA staff for their dedicated service, even in the most dire conditions and at great personal danger to their own lives. We express our condolences to the families, friends and colleagues of the 252 UNRWA staff members tragically killed over the past year in the occupied Palestinian territory, the overwhelming majority in Gaza. This is the highest number of casualties suffered by humanitarians and by the UN in any conflict since the organisation's establishment, and we stress the imperative of ensuring accountability. We commend UNRWA's Commissioner General for his leadership and his staff for their tireless efforts to deliver on UNRWA's mandate and their commitment to uphold the humanitarian principles of neutrality, independence, impartiality and humanity, and to fully implement the recommendations of the Colonna report. The General Assembly must act swiftly to safeguard the mandate of UNRWA to ensure the well-being, development and protection of Palestine refugees in all 5 fields of operation, and to sustain its long-term investment in peace, pending the achievement of a just solution, including for the plight of the Palestine refugees. We must redouble our efforts to support the agency and to prevent any further obstruction of its indispensable and life-saving assistance in the face of the catastrophic situation in Gaza. The refugee population has suffered repeat dispossession, displacement and trauma for decades. UNRWA is indispensable to civilians facing military attack, hunger, disease, poverty, loss of learning and livelihoods, denial of humanitarian access, mass forced displacement and mass destruction of civilian infrastructure. It simply must be protected. We must act swiftly to ensure the protection of the Palestinian civilian population, including by ensuring the provision of immediate, unimpeded humanitarian access at scale throughout Gaza, with UNRWA playing its indispensable humanitarian role and serving as the backbone of the UN humanitarian delivery system. We must act now in line with our collective obligations under international law, including humanitarian and human rights law, to preserve UNRWA, a lifeline for the well-being, sustenance, hope and dignity of millions of refugees and displaced civilians. We must also make every effort to make a just and peaceful resolution of the Palestine question in all its aspects a reality, in accordance with international law and relevant UN resolutions. In closing, President, on behalf of the co-sponsors, Ireland calls on all states and members of the General Assembly to vote in favour of the draft resolution contained in document L32. We express our deep appreciation in advance to all delegations upholding their international legal obligations and rising to the historic responsibility we must all bear at this time of grave, grave crisis. I thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ireland. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia to introduce draft resolution A/ES-10/L.33.
Mr. President, Indonesia is honored to introduce draft resolution L33 entitled Demand for Ceasefire in Gaza in this resumed 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly. This resolution, presented amid an unprecedented and devastating crisis on the Palestinian people in the occupied Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem, and particularly in the Gaza Strip. This draft resolution underscores the high urgency, absolute necessity for the General Assembly to act now, once again, to demand a ceasefire. We should not let the international community to fail again to act swiftly and responsibly. Over the past 14 months, Gaza continues to be under relentless siege and military assault by Israel, without conditions described as appalling and apocalyptic. We must prevent further catastrophic loss of life and destruction. Mr. President, 1 year ago, in this Assembly, following the veto of a permanent member of the Security Council, 153 countries supported GA Resolution ES-10/22, demanding a pause, an immediate ceasefire, a humanitarian ceasefire, compliance by all parties to their international legal obligation, especially protection of civilians, as well as the release of all hostages. Unfortunately, that resolution was not followed through. We must thus ask ourselves, how many lives could have been saved? How much suffering avoided? And how much destruction prevented if the demands for a ceasefire had been respected? If Israel respected international law, its charter obligation, and listened to the clear voice of conscience of the international community, instead of persisting with its crime, if accountability had been enforced and veto not used to shield these actions. It is time to change the trajectory, to save 2 million children, women, and men in Gaza, alleviate their suffering, and provide them with immediate assistance, relief, and hope. Accountability and justice must be pursued, and a path towards peace must be chartered. This must begin with a ceasefire to stop violence and protect innocent civilians from further harm, including by immediate actions in accordance with ICJ provisional measures. Mr. President, today, as the casualty has tragically surpassed 150,000 Palestinians, 70% of whom are children and women, and with over 1.9 million Gazans displaced under inhumane conditions, deprived of essentials of life. We return to this General Assembly with an urgent appeal for collective action. We cannot remain silent in the face of this abhorrent situation. We must uphold our legal, political, humanitarian, and moral obligation. I repeat, our moral obligations. In the face of yet another veto and the Security Council's inability to implement its own resolutions, including resolutions 2735, the General Assembly must act to fulfill its charter duties. Let us urgently and collectively act to establish an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, to silence the gun, to stop the bloodshed, and protect the Palestinian civilian population under Israel's illegal occupation from further harm and to alleviate their dramatic suffering. Mr. President, there is no other way to end this carnage, to save human life. We need an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire. We need accountability for all grave breaches of international law, including humanitarian and human rights law perpetrated by Israel, for all the war crimes, crimes against humanity, and acts of genocides committed. We must end the suffering. We must begin the path to recovery and swiftly pursue political solution to achieve long overdue justice and freedom for the Palestinian people. Indonesia thanked the 47 co-sponsors of this resolution. On behalf of the co-sponsors and in the name of justice and humanity, Indonesia urges all member states to support draft resolution L33. Let us act collectively to honor our shared responsibility, uphold international law in this critical moment. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia. We shall now proceed to consider draft resolutions A/ES-10/L.32 and A/ES-10/L.33. I give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Thank you, Mr. President. The President's statement concerning draft resolution L33 is made in the context of Rule 153 of the Rules of Procedure of the General Assembly. The President's statement has been also distributed to Member States. Under the terms of OP 7, 9, and 10, the General Assembly would stress the need for accountability and request the Secretary General in this regard to present in the written assessment regarding the implementation of the present resolution and in coordination with the High Commissioner for Human Rights, proposals on how the United Nations could help advance accountability through existing mechanisms and through the establishment of new mechanisms based on its experience in other situations. Request a written assessment from the Secretary General on the implementation of this resolution within 3 weeks of its adoption, and further request the Secretary General to submit a comprehensive written report within 60 days of the adoption of this resolution, which should include a needs assessment for Gaza in the short, medium, and long term, an elaboration of the humanitarian, social, and economic consequences of the conflict in Gaza, and an overview of the work of different parts of the United Nations system relevant to Gaza, along with the recommendations on how to strengthen coordination across these parts. The requests contained in OP 7, 9, and 10 of the draft resolution would entail 2 pre-session documents with a total word count of 13,000 words in all 6 official languages in 2025. This would constitute an addition to the documentation workload for the Department for General Assembly and Conference Management in 2025, and the related non-recurrent resources requirements are estimated at $37,500. However, the department will make every effort to implement the request within its existing capacities. Accordingly, should the General Assembly adopt draft resolution A/ES10/L33, no additional requirements would arise under the program budget for 2025. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Secretariat. For your information, the draft resolutions have closed for e-sponsorship. I now give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will address additional co-sponsors for both L32 and L33. First, L32. Since the submission of the draft resolution, and in addition to the delegations listed on the L document, the following countries have also become co-sponsors of L32. Bahrain, Bangladesh, Belize, the plurinational state of Bolivia, Brazil, Brunei Darussalam, Chile, Colombia, Cuba, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Djibouti, Guyana, Honduras, Iraq, Ireland, Libya, Luxembourg, Maldives, Mauritania, Morocco, Namibia, Nicaragua, Norway, Oman, Pakistan, Portugal, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Saudi Arabia, Senegal, Slovenia, Somalia, South Africa, Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, Tunisia, Turkey, United Arab Emirates, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and Yemen. If any other countries wish to co-sponsor L32, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. I see Gambia, St. Kitts and Nevis, Nigeria, Somalia, although Somalia's name was already read out as an additional co-sponsor, United Republic of Tanzania. Now, to move to L33. Since the submission of the draft resolution, and in addition to the delegations listed on the L document, the following countries have also become co-sponsors of L33. Bahrain, Belize, plurinational state of Bolivia, Brazil, Brunei Darussalam, Chile, Colombia, Cuba, Djibouti, Guyana, Honduras, Ireland, Libya, Luxembourg, Maldives, Malta, Mauritania, Morocco, Namibia, Nicaragua, Norway, Oman, Pakistan, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Senegal, Slovenia, Somalia, South Africa, Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, Turkey, United Arab Emirates, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and Yemen. If any other countries wish to co-sponsor L33, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. I see Nigeria, St. Kitts and Nevis, United Republic of Tanzania. Thank you, Mr. President. This concludes additional co-sponsorship.
I thank the representative of the Secretariat. Delegations wishing to make a statement in the explanation of vote before the vote on any proposal under this item are invited to do so now in one intervention. After action on all of them, there will be an opportunity for explanations of vote after the vote on any or all of them. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote before the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I give the floor to Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. The resolutions before the Assembly today are beyond logic. They defy all concepts of morality and the evidence we have laid before you for years. By voting for these resolutions, you are not voting to protect humanitarian values, but to protect an organization that has become a haven for terror. You vote for the resolutions knowing the truth, knowing that UNRWA is not a neutral actor, but an entity hopelessly infiltrated by Hamas, knowing that its facilities have been used to store weapons, its schools to indoctrinate children with hatred, and its staff to aid and act as terrorists. The vote today is not a vote for compassion. It is a vote for complicity. As if this betrayal is not enough, you pushed for a resolution that failed to even condition a ceasefire on the release of the 100 hostages still held by Hamas. By demanding a ceasefire today without addressing the hostages, this Assembly will once again side with those who weaponize human suffering. It will send a message that the lives of innocent Israelis, including children, are not worth your consideration. This is not diplomacy. It is appeasement. It is enabling terror and abandoning the innocent. Today, I sit here with evidence in hand. Letters upon letters that Israel has written to UNRWA over the years, each one a warning, each one a clear call to action, and yet nothing was done. Commissioner General Lazzarini complains of reputational damage of so-called disinformation campaign against UNRWA by Israel. I would like to ask Mr. Lazzarini, where were your complaints when Hamas built tunnels under your schools? Where was your outrage when murderers you employed used those schools as terror bases? Where was your accountability when we sent you these letters exposing terrorists on your payroll? In my hand is a letter written in November 2003, 21 years ago, in which we warned about terrorists hiding, meeting, and even training in UNRWA facilities. UNRWA did not act. In 2011, 13 years ago, we warned UNRWA about Hamas operatives working in UNRWA schools. We even provided the names and IDs of 10 Hamas terrorists employed by UNRWA. Nothing was done. In fact, the last name on this list, Najee Salam Abu Aziz, was an UNRWA principal, believe it or not. Of course, no action was taken against him. In the meantime, this year, he allowed his school to be used as a launch pad for anti-tank missiles by his fellow Hamas terrorists. In 2017, a Hamas tunnel was discovered beneath an UNRWA school led by a principal who publicly pledged allegiance to Hamas. You again remained silent. Just this July, We provided the names of over 100 UNRWA employees who were members of Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Again, nothing was done. These are only a few examples out of many over the decades. UNRWA's inaction speaks volumes. They did not act when we presented evidence. They did not act when Hamas turned schools into ammunition stores. They did not act when the lives of innocent Israelis were at stake. Now, the New York Times has recently confirmed what we have long known, and I urge you all to read this article in the New York Times. Hamas has infiltrated UNRWA at every level. It is simply a documented fact. To Hamas, UNRWA schools are, and I quote from Hamas's own documents, they call it the best obstacles to shield their terror operations. Gazan residents themselves have admitted to the New York Times that it is a, quote, open secret that Hamas operatives work in UNRWA schools, some even carrying Kalashnikovs after class instead of textbooks. Yet, this assembly rewards such complicity with continued funding and unwavering support. And now it seeks to demand a ceasefire without conditioning the release of the hostages still suffering in Hamas's dungeons. You will have abandoned them, you will have ignored their families, you will have emboldened their captures. To stand by UNRWA today is to stand by Hamas. The same Hamas that orchestrated the October 7 massacre, that butchered over 1,200 innocent people, and that still holds 100 hostages. To demand a ceasefire while ignoring these hostages is to surrender to terror. Distinguished colleagues, a future for Gaza must be one without Hamas, but it must also be one without UNRWA. Without its complicity, aid could flow freely, schools could teach peace instead of hatred, and the people of Gaza could finally begin to rebuild. This assembly has a choice today: to confront terror and its enablers, or to appease them. If you choose to stand by UNRWA and abandon the hostages, you will have chosen appeasement. History will not forget this choice, and neither will we. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Israel. I give the floor to Paraguay.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. La delegación del Paraguay agradece la oportunidad de tomar la palabra en ocasión de realizar una explicación de voto antes del voto sobre los proyectos de resolución AES-10, L32 y L33. Señor presidente, estimados colegas, el Paraguay ha renunciado a la guerra y la considera fuera del derecho internacional. Además, nuestro país ha vivido en carne propia las atrocidades de los conflictos armados y nuestra población conoce el sufrimiento que ellos conllevan. Por ello, abogamos por la paz y el entendimiento entre las naciones, promovemos la tolerancia y reafirmamos que el camino del entendimiento es siempre el diálogo. Señor presidente, el camino hacia una paz duradera y el cumplimiento del derecho internacional humanitario implican atender las necesidades y reivindicaciones de todas las partes afectadas y tener en consideración todas las aristas. Lo contrario, llevará indefectiblemente, como hasta ahora, a postergar una solución sostenible con el consecuente sufrimiento de miles de personas. El hecho de que los proponentes persistan en la inclusión de medidas distintas a aquellas tendientes a lograr un cese al fuego, fin último de la resolución L33, perseverando además en mantener en los textos la condena a una sola de las partes, nos lleva a que ellas no tengan un mayor apoyo. Deseamos con fervor una solución pacífica al conflicto que soportan las poblaciones de Israel y de Palestina, mas al no encontrar el balance en ellas, en las propuestas presentadas, el Paraguay no podrá acompañarlas. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
I thank Paraguay. I give the floor to the Marshall Islands.
Thank you, Mr. President. Regarding the statement and explanation of UNGA Draft Resolution 33, L33, titled Demand for Ceasefire in Gaza, the Republic of the Marshall Islands welcomes the recent ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon and mediating countries and urges all parties to abide by its terms. Yet other areas of instability, violence, and repression and humanitarian crisis persist in Gaza and nearby. The fate of hostages remain unresolved. The underlying initial violence and brutal horror of Hamas's October 7 massacre must be condemned and acknowledged, and the perpetrators and collaborators brought to justice. However, this cannot be the retributive justification for the further loss of tens of thousands of civilian lives and a humanitarian crisis. Ending civilian suffering and further loss of life in Gaza broadly requires an urgent ceasefire, unconditional release of hostages, addressing and accounting for the remains of dead hostages, and humanitarian assistance at scale, all elements put together before the UN Security Council. And most urgently, we remain nearly adrift, unclear on where, when, and what the intended endpoint is to this conflict and humanitarian crisis without achieving the above. We do not doubt the strongest efforts of many nations involved in working towards peace and ceasefire, and yet here we are again. The Security Council is failing between its permanent 5 memberships. And while a small nation might not alone be able to restructure or unravel that body, we will not hesitate to be vocal about the wrongs where they persist. We want to be among the optimists that an international peace process now remains before us. A 2-state solution with clear steps to lasting peace would, by logic and definition, include addressing a Palestinian state. But working through such a process towards a real and lasting peace would require political will, leadership, mandate, and active dialogue from everyone at the table, and demand a very dramatic reversal from where we all are today. Otherwise, the same words will only be read over again, and an opportunity for change, for peace, and for change would be missed. This institution, in the ideals deep within the Charter, is capable of far more and was intended for far more. Regarding Resolution 32 on the UN Works Relief Agency, the Marshall Islands is concerned regarding the Israeli-Knesset severance of the UNRWA relationship. Whatever the challenges or reform needs of UNRWA, there is also an urgent humanitarian crisis, one which has worsened since the start of the conflict. It is important that UNRWA functions as an objective UN entity and that there would be due accountability and appropriate management reform be addressed. However, the need for improvement is no justification for failing to address urgent humanitarian issues through any and all elected channels. I thank you.
I thank the Marshall Islands. We have heard the last speaker in explanation of vote before the vote. Before proceeding further, I wish to address the question concerning the majority required for the adoption of the draft resolutions. In light of Article 18, paragraph 2 and 3 of the Charter of the United Nations, is there any objection to taking action on draft resolutions A, ES 10 L 32 and A, ES 10 L 33 by a 2/3 majority of the members present and voting? I see no objection. The 2/3 majority of members present and voting is therefore required for the adoption of draft resolution A/ES-10/L32 and A/ES-10/L33. The Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution A/ES-10/L.32 entitled Support for the Mandate of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft resolution A/ES-10/L32, please signify. Those against, abstentions.
The Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/ES-10/L32 entitled Support for the Mandate of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. Will all delegations confirm that the votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 159, against 9, abstentions 11. Draft resolution A/ES-10/L32 is adopted. The Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution A/ES-10/L33 entitled Demand for Ceasefire in Gaza. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft resolution A/ES-10L33, please signify. Those against, abstentions.
The Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/ES-10/L33 entitled Demand for Ceasefire in Gaza. Will all delegations confirm that the votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 158, against 9, abstentions 13. The draft resolution A/ES-10/L33 is adopted. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I give the floor to New Zealand.
President, New Zealand welcomes the adoption of today's resolutions and voted in support of the resolutions after careful consideration. The situation in Gaza remains untenable. An immediate ceasefire is urgently needed, and the remaining hostages must be unconditionally released. Palestinian civilians continue to pay the price of the conflict between Israel and Hamas. They deserve an immediate ceasefire, unimpeded access to humanitarian aid, and an end to the spiralling tensions. New Zealand has been clear from the outset that the protection of civilians is paramount and a requirement of international law. New Zealand welcomes international efforts to secure a ceasefire in Gaza and calls on the parties to implement the provisions of Security Council Resolution 2735 regarding an immediate ceasefire. A negotiated political solution is needed to achieve lasting peace and security for Israel and Palestine. Diplomacy can work where there is a political will. The UNRWA resolution reflects a view overwhelmingly shared by the international community that the humanitarian situation in Gaza is catastrophic and that nothing should stand in the way of food, medical assistance and shelter for those in need. This resolution also calls for parties to uphold UN mandates as set by UN member states. The role of UNRWA was defined and created by us as UN member states. New Zealand notes that UNRWA's mandate has been continuously extended since 1949. UNRWA's mandate to ensure the humanitarian and development needs of almost 6 million Palestinian refugees must be respected. The UN system must be allowed to execute the role the member states have given it. There is also work to be done on the part of UNRWA to strengthen its adherence to UN values and humanitarian principles, including neutrality. New Zealand is following closely UNRWA's implementation of Catherine Colonna's review recommendations and looks forward to the full implementation of those recommendations. New Zealand has made clear to UNRWA our expectations of the organisation. We have also made clear our expectation of the parties to the Israel-Hamas conflict, that is, compliance with international law, including international humanitarian law. We are pleased this resolution puts on the record the importance of honouring and respecting UN mandates. Thank you, President.
I thank New Zealand. I give the floor to Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, let me extend our appreciation to Palestine for its initiative and flexibility during the negotiation of the two draft resolutions. I must say that neither of them is perfect. Important elements are missing, such as clear and strong condemnation of Hamas' brutal acts of terror and their continued hostage-taking in violation of international law. However, both of the resolutions represent a much-needed display of political will of the international community. The tragedy in Gaza is never-ending. Every passing day brings additional casualties of innocent civilians and increasing the suffering of both Palestinians and Israelis, including the hostages. The humanitarian situation, which is already described as apocalyptic, is getting worse as time goes by. Although it is too late to save those lives already lost, the need for immediate ceasefire, the release of all remaining hostages, and the drastic expansion of humanitarian aid to Gaza remains crucial. These are the pillars of the ceasefire resolution and what Japan has consistently advocated for the Security Council. It is also essential now to preserve UNRWA. The agency is the backbone of humanitarian assistance to the more than 2 million disparate people of Gaza. The agency will also play a critical role to rebuild human dignity of Palestinian refugees after a post-ceasefire period. However, this indispensable organization is at the brink of collapse following the adoption of the two Knesset laws severely restricting its operation. Our concerted efforts to maintain the agency are urgently needed. This is the aim of this resolution, and Japan fully shares this objective. At the same time, this resolution contains an important call for UNRWA to fully implement the recommendations of the independent review group, and Japan supports this aspect as well. Therefore, we voted in favor of the two draft resolutions. Having said that, today's adoption is not the end goal, as nothing will change if the resolutions remain solely on paper. We have a collective responsibility to make sure that this Assembly's demands are addressed by the parties. For this purpose, we must not overlook the importance of a negotiated settlement between the parties. In this vein, Japan is encouraged by the reports on the resumption of ceasefire talks and commends the tireless efforts of the mediators. Finally, Japan is steadfastly committed to a lasting peace for both Israel and Palestine in the form of a two-state solution, and will continue to make all possible diplomatic efforts to this end. Likewise, we will remain at the forefront of humanitarian assistance to the most vulnerable, and also stand ready to contribute to the early recovery and reconstruction of Gaza. I thank you.
I thank Japan. I give the floor to Guatemala.
Presidente, desde 1947, Guatemala ha mantenido la firme convicción en que la coexistencia pacífica del pueblo israelí y el pueblo palestino debe estar basada en la preeminencia del derecho internacional. Como Estado con una sólida vocación pacifista, reconocemos la necesidad de buscar una solución pacífica al conflicto, abogando que la misma sea facilitada por la comunidad internacional y que las Naciones Unidas auspicien un proceso político encaminado a promover una paz justa y sostenible en la región, con el involucramiento de todas las partes concernidas. Esto solamente es posible bajo una solución de dos estados que atienda las legítimas preocupaciones de seguridad de Israel y permita la consolidación de un Estado palestino que sea política y económicamente viable. Creemos que el Estado palestino debe convivir con Israel en virtud de fronteras claramente definidas, seguras, pacíficas e internacionalmente reconocidas, de conformidad con las resoluciones pertinentes de las Naciones Unidas. Pero mientras se logra el anhelo por la paz, Guatemala reconoce la vital y singular labor que ejerce la Agencia de las Naciones Unidas para los Refugiados de Palestina en el Medio Oriente, la cual, bajo el mandato otorgado por esta Asamblea General, busca garantizar el acceso a educación, sanidad, ayuda humanitaria y servicios sociales a los refugiados y refugiadas de Palestina. Un organismo que actualmente sirve, como señaló su titular, como el único pilar de vida que queda en pie para los palestinos, ya que sin su labor colapsará la respuesta humanitaria de la ONU. Presidente, como lo hemos denunciado en varias oportunidades, el veto de cualquier proyecto de resolución que demande un alto al fuego deja en evidencia la parálisis del Consejo de Seguridad, máximo órgano encargado de mantener la paz y seguridad internacionales. Una vez más, abogamos por evitar el ejercicio del veto cuando se trate de prevenir o detener situaciones que involucren atrocidades en masa. De igual manera, Guatemala resalta la necesidad que el Consejo de Seguridad adopte resoluciones que tomen en cuenta y de forma balanceada todos los elementos que permitan el cese inmediato de hostilidades y atrocidades entre las partes involucradas, la urgencia de asegurar el acceso de la ayuda humanitaria en Gaza, así como también la liberación de todos los rehenes con el fin de proteger los derechos humanos de las poblaciones implicadas.
Guatemala reitera su disposición para apoyar todo esfuerzo encaminado hacia el establecimiento de una paz duradera en la región, cimentada en el respeto mutuo y el pleno apego al derecho internacional. Es por estas razones que Guatemala ha apoyado los dos proyectos de resolución presentados el día de hoy. Muchas gracias.
I thank Guatemala. I give the floor to Australia.
Thank you, President. I will speak to both the resolutions we have considered today. Although Australia does not agree with everything in the resolution titled Support for the Mandate of UNRWA, our vote in favour reflects our view that UNRWA must be able to continue its life-saving work. That's also why Australia has funded the organisation every year since 1951. UNRWA provides desperately needed services to civilians in the occupied Palestinian territories and across the region. As the Security Council has said, UNRWA is the backbone of the humanitarian response to the catastrophic situation in Gaza. We join the Security Council in expressing grave concern over legislation adopted by the Israeli Knesset. Limiting UNRWA's operations will only exacerbate an already terrible humanitarian crisis. As stated in this resolution, UNRWA has a responsibility to address any credible allegations and to ensure accountability for any violations of the agency's principles of neutrality, impartiality and independence. We acknowledge the commitment made by the United Nations Secretary-General and UNRWA to implement fully the recommendations of the independent review led by Catherine Colonna. We call for their accelerated implementation in line with UNRWA's commitment to the principle of neutrality. We note UNRWA's measures to terminate the employment of UNRWA staff members following the 7 October atrocities carried out by Hamas, atrocities that should have been unequivocally condemned by this resolution. Any involvement or affiliation with terrorist organisations cannot be tolerated. Australia will continue to press the United Nations and UNRWA to safeguard the organisation's neutrality. Australia reiterates calls for the protection of humanitarian and United Nations personnel, including UNRWA staff, to enable them to perform their life-saving work. The best protection for humanitarian personnel and civilians is ceasefire. Australia will continue to support a strong and robust multilateral system, including the protection of United Nations agencies to do their critical work. In relation to the resolution entitled Demand for Ceasefire in Gaza, I wish to address certain reservations, but first I will outline why Australia voted in favour. First, Australia is committed to working with the international community to end this conflict, to stop the suffering, and immediately and unconditionally to secure the release of all hostages held by Hamas. Tomorrow marks 1 year since Australia joined 152 other countries in voting for a ceasefire in this Assembly. Further delay will only see more lives lost. Second, this resolution's demand for full, rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian assistance to Gaza has never been more necessary. The current situation in Gaza is catastrophic, the human suffering unbearable. In Israel's response to Hamas atrocities on October 7, more than 44,000 Palestinians have been killed, including more than 13,000 children. Nearly all of Gaza's 2.1 million people have lost their homes and do not have enough food, water, medicine or shelter. Third, along with the international community, Australia reiterates our call on all parties to comply fully with international law. Civilians and humanitarian workers must be protected. Israel must take urgent action to alleviate this humanitarian crisis in line with the binding orders of the International Court of Justice. Fourth, Australia supports this resolution's unwavering commitment to the vision of a two-state solution because it is the only way out of this terrible cycle of violence. Fifth, we support this resolution because of its call for the immediate and unconditional release of hostages and the urgency of the current crisis. In terms of reservations, we support the United States proposal for an immediate ceasefire deal with the release of hostages as endorsed by the United Nations Security Council. Ceasefires have conditions that parties must agree. This reality should have been reflected in the resolution. The fact it has not is a shortcoming. Moreover, Australia remains unequivocal in our condemnation of Hamas. This resolution should have done the same. For their atrocities on 7 October that left 1,200 Israelis dead and more than 200 hostages taken, and all their acts of terror. Australia repeats our demand for Hamas to release all hostages immediately and unconditionally. Hamas must lay down their arms. There can be no role for terrorists in the future governance of Gaza. Finally, President, Australia continues to give careful consideration to the International Court of Justice's conclusions in its advisory opinion. Our vote is not determinative of Australia's position on all the conclusions in that opinion, including those recalled in this resolution. Thank you, President.
I thank Australia. I give the floor to Czechia.
Thank you, Mr. President. As we gather here today, the Middle East is engulfed in profound turmoil. My country, Czechia, is deeply troubled by the ongoing suffering endured by civilians in the region. We are deeply concerned about the critical situation of the civilian population in Gaza, who deserve to live in peace and dignity. We welcome any meaningful efforts to end the violence. Let me acknowledge that both resolutions adopted today contain a number of constructive elements that represent positive progress. We commend the efforts to find common ground and address the urgent challenges in the region. However, we must not overlook the horrific terrorist attacks of the 7th of October that plunged the region into this current cycle of conflict. Hamas terrorists unleashed a deadly rampage, brutally killing and maiming innocent civilians and taking hostages in a shocking display of barbarity. There can be no excuse or justification for such egregious acts, which have had fatal consequences for all people in the region. Once again, my government regrets that this esteemed assembly did not take a more forceful stance in condemning the actions of Hamas. Moreover, the resolution L33 fails to unequivocally link a durable ceasefire to the release of all the hostages. To omit this crucial linkage risks sending a dangerously misguided signal to Hamas that their reckless reign of terror may somehow be vindicated. We must not abandon the hostages and their families. It is due to this omission that Czechia cannot support this resolution, and that is why we voted against it. Let us be clear, Hamas too has a choice to make. They could immediately release the hostages, they could cease using civilians as human shields and stop exploiting civilian infrastructure to launch terrorist attacks. It is Hamas terrorists who have imperiled millions of Palestinian civilians. Mr. President, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza has reached a critical juncture. The population is in dire need of food, water, medical supplies, and other essential items. While we fully support urgent calls to step up the delivery of vital humanitarian aid, we must also acknowledge and rectify certain operational shortcomings within UNRWA. We must make every effort to ensure beyond any shadow of a doubt that Hamas and other terrorist groups cannot exploit the existing system for distributing critical assistance. Equally important is guaranteeing strict neutrality, accountability, and oversight in all aspects of UNRWA's operations. In this respect, we continue to closely monitor and evaluate the implementation of the recommendations of the Independent Review Group. The resolution L32 in our assessment does not sufficiently address these pressing concerns. Therefore, we have decided to abstain from voting on this resolution. Distinguished colleagues, I would like to conclude by emphasizing that reestablishing a political horizon for a two-state solution remains of a paramount importance. A negotiated settlement remains the singular path to guaranteeing security, political stability, and democratic development for both Israel and Palestine. We encourage regional actors to pursue a course of cooperation, including through the Abraham Accords, to build a brighter future for the Middle East. Rather than introducing new initiatives here in New York, we need positive developments on the ground in the region itself. I thank you.
I thank Czechia. I give the floor to Hungary.
Mr. President, we are here today to discuss the dire humanitarian situation and the demand for an end to the conflict in Gaza. We must not forget that the conflict that the General Assembly seeks to end by imposing an unconditional ceasefire was ignited by the horrendous and brutal acts of terrorism committed by Hamas on October 7, 2023. Any country would have the right and responsibility to ensure that such an attack could never happen again, as permitted under IHL. It has been more than a year since the terrorist attacks that led to the escalation of the conflict, which has caused a devastating humanitarian crisis. On October 7, 2023, 1,195 people were murdered in Israel. A further 5,432 people have been injured, and 251 have been taken hostage. Since then, more than 43,000 people have been killed in Gaza, and many more have been injured. Hostages are still being held, and innumerable survivors are traumatized. The picture today is catastrophic, and we express our solidarity with Israeli and Palestinian innocent civilians caught in the conflict. There are no excuses left for Hamas to continue rejecting a ceasefire and put innocent Palestinian civilians at risk every day. It is high time for this conflict to end, for the hostages to be released, and for Palestinian civilians to begin rebuilding their lives. However, the fighting must end in a sustainable way. A ceasefire between Israel and Hamas is the only way to bring about a durable end to this conflict. But Hamas has failed to accept any agreement so far that would bring hostages home, ensure Israel's security, enable a surge in humanitarian relief to Palestinians, and set the stage for a political settlement which can provide a better future for Israelis and Palestinians alike. All civilian life matters equally. We note with utmost concern the unacceptable number of civilian casualties, especially children, as well as the catastrophic levels of hunger and imminent risk of famine caused by the insufficient entry of aid into Gaza. It is time for this conflict to end. The only durable way to resolve this conflict is to establish a ceasefire that also guarantees the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held in Gaza. These two urgent goals are inextricably linked. An unconditional ceasefire would mean that hostages would likely never return home. We once again call on Hamas and other terrorist groups within Gaza to release all remaining hostages immediately without precondition, cease hostilities, and spare all civilians from further suffering. We recall that there is still a Hungarian citizen being held hostage by the terrorists. Right now, the international community must focus on implementing the existing framework for resolving the conflict. Security Council Resolution 2735, which offers a glimmer of hope for the peaceful settlement of this conflict and gives diplomacy a chance. Hungary calls for the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2735 without delay and without conditions, which would lead to an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, a significant and sustained increase in flow of humanitarian assistance throughout Gaza. I thank you.
I thank Hungary. I give the floor to Germany.
Mr. President, Germany voted in favor of the two resolutions. We call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and the unconditional release of all hostages. The unbearable suffering that followed the heinous terrorist attacks on 7th of October of last year must cease immediately for the sake of Palestinians in Gaza and the hostages and their families. A lasting peace in the region can only be achieved through a negotiated two-state solution. Only when Israel's security is ensured and Palestinians have their own state where they can live in dignity and safety will both peoples be able to live side by side in peace. Germany, alongside its partners, remains steadfast in its commitment to work towards this goal. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is catastrophic. We urgently need a humanitarian surge as winter starts. Israel must uphold its commitment to flood Gaza with aid, and that access be guaranteed at all times. Germany is the second largest contributor of humanitarian aid to Gaza, and together with our partners has consistently been and continues to be engaged in substantive financial and diplomatic humanitarian support to increase the flow of aid into Gaza in order to alleviate the unimaginable suffering of the Palestinians there. At this critical moment, UNRWA's role is essential. Germany remains steadfast in its commitment to supporting UNRWA and Palestinians in need in Gaza and across the region. UNRWA remains indispensable for delivering essential support to millions of Palestinian refugees in Gaza, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and across the entire regions. Against this backdrop, Germany is gravely concerned about the adoption of 2 laws targeting UNRWA by the Knesset. UNRWA must, as well as other UN organizations and agencies, must be fully able to deliver humanitarian aid and assistance to save lives and ease the suffering. We urge the Israeli government to abide by its international obligations, respect the privileges and immunities of UNRWA, and live up to its responsibility to facilitate full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian assistance to the civilian population in Gaza. We commend UNRWA for taking steps to address allegations regarding individual employees' support for terrorist organizations and to pursue and implement reforms of internal processes. We expect UNRWA to continue its path of reform, demonstrating its commitment to the principle of neutrality, treat allegations swiftly and as a matter of priority, and ensure that its activities remain entirely in line with its mandate. We will continue to actively monitor and support this process. Germany unequivocally condemns the horrific attacks carried out by Hamas and other terrorist groups on October 7, 2023, as well as the consistent attacks against Israel by these terrorist groups, and we call on the General Assembly to do the same. Germany remains committed to the security of Israel. Israel, like all states, has the right to defend itself against armed attacks by terrorists and extremists. At the same time, this right must be exercised in line with international humanitarian law, and accountability of all sides needs to be ensured. On accountability, we are in favor of strengthening the existing structures rather than creating new ones, which could result in duplication. Additional mechanisms could weaken rather than strengthen the pursuit of justice and peace. Mr. President, the entire region is undergoing historic changes. The ceasefire agreement in Lebanon offers hope. The abhorrent dictatorship in Syria has fallen. Let us work together now with determination and commitment to stop the suffering in Gaza, to liberate the hostages, and to lay the foundation for a more peaceful Middle East. A Middle East where Israelis, Palestinians, and all people in the region can live side by side in peace and security. Germany remains fully committed to this goal. I thank you.
I thank Germany. I give the floor to Bulgaria.
Thank you, Mr. President. I take the floor to deliver an explanation of vote on Resolution L32, support for the mandate of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East. Bulgaria is gravely alarmed by the catastrophic situation of civilians in Gaza and reiterates its call for uninterrupted, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access and aid to reach those in need through all necessary measures. While recognizing UNRWA's important and indispensable role in providing humanitarian relief and essential services to Palestine refugees and acknowledging the steps taken towards greater accountability, we are of the view that the resolution does not sufficiently address the need for robust safeguards to reinforce neutrality, operational transparency, and impartiality UNRWA's activities. For that reason, Bulgaria was not in a position to support it. Bulgaria underscores the importance of upholding the humanitarian principles, ensuring that neutrality and accountability of aid organizations, and pursuing durable solutions that address both immediate needs and long-term challenges. Thank you.
I thank Bulgaria. I give the floor to Belgium.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Chers collègues, la Belgique a voté en faveur des deux projets de résolution. Elle en soutient pleinement leurs principaux éléments. Un cessez-le-feu immédiat respecté par toutes les parties, la libération immédiate et inconditionnelle de tous les otages, un accès sans entrave de l'aide humanitaire aux populations civiles et, tant qu'il n'y aura pas de solution durable au conflit, la mise en œuvre essentielle du mandat de l'UNRWA. Chers collègues, il faut rompre avec le dialogue de sourds auquel nous assistons et travailler à une solution commune, rompre avec le cycle de violence, rompre avec la déshumanisation et les discours de haine. La diplomatie doit reprendre le dessus tel qu'elle a pu le faire au Liban. Cela requiert des concessions de part et d'autre. Rien ne peut justifier le massacre de plus de 44 000 civils à Gaza et ailleurs. Seul un cessez-le-feu immédiat peut mettre un terme aux souffrances inacceptables infligées aux populations. La Belgique exhorte les parties à faire preuve de bonne volonté pour que ces négociations puissent enfin aboutir. L'horreur doit cesser et rien ne peut justifier la prise en otage des civils. Les otages détenus depuis le 7 octobre doivent être libérés immédiatement et sans condition. Les familles doivent connaître le sort de leurs proches disparus. Ceci est également le cas pour les personnes en détention, surtout les mineurs. La voie devant mener à la solution de deux États démocratiques, Israël et la Palestine, vivant côte à côte, en paix, à l'intérieur de frontières sûres et reconnues, a été balisée par le Conseil de sécurité. Il nous revient d'agir. Il faut prévenir et condamner le terrorisme. Condamnons avec la plus grande fermeté les actes terroristes barbares perpétrés par le Hamas le 7 octobre. Il faut créer les conditions nécessaires à la promotion de la paix et aux négociations. Associons-nous au travail collectif de l'Alliance globale pour donner forme à la solution des deux États. Il faut enfin inverser les tendances négatives sur le terrain. Employons-nous à mettre en œuvre l'avis consultatif de la Cour internationale de justice sur l'illégalité des colonies et rejetons catégoriquement la poursuite de la politique d'expansion menée par Israël. Nous nous inquiétons vivement des rumeurs d'annexion de territoires palestiniens et de transfert de l'administration des territoires occupés vers l'administration civile. Seule la voie politique peut conduire à la paix et à la réconciliation. Nous attendons un engagement plus ferme en ce sens de la part des parties impliquées. En l'absence d'une solution politique, le travail indispensable de l'UNRWA doit se poursuivre. La campagne de désinformation à son encontre est inacceptable. De même, l'application des lois adoptées par la Knesset en violation des obligations d'Israël en vertu du droit international représente un précédent désastreux pour le système multilatéral. La Belgique salue la lettre du secrétaire général du 9 décembre à ce sujet et s'associe à ces considérations. La Belgique n'a jamais suspendu son financement de l'agence et s'est engagée sur le long terme via un accord multiannuel de 3 ans. Nous invitons les membres, tout particulièrement ceux qui en ont les moyens, mais n'ont pas encore contribué au financement de l'UNRWA, à en faire de même et à honorer les engagements pris. La mise en œuvre effective du rapport Colonna est importante afin d'améliorer la neutralité de l'UNRWA. Nous saluons les efforts déjà entrepris par l'agence. Des efforts supplémentaires sont indispensables avec notre soutien collectif. Enfin, la Belgique appuie les initiatives garantissant la reddition des comptes. Le droit international et le droit international humanitaire ne peuvent être appliqués de manière sélective, au risque de les affaiblir dans leur ensemble. Je vous remercie.
I thank Belgium. I give the floor to the Republic of Korea.
Mr. President, last month, as one of the elected members of the Secretary Council, the Republic of Korea participated in proposing a draft resolution to the Council, demanding an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire, in parallel with demanding an immediate and unconditional release of hostages. The Republic of Korea believes that in order to urgently save lives and alleviate the extreme suffering of Palestine in Gaza, an immediate ceasefire is not an option, but an imperative. Based on this belief, we co-penned the E10 draft resolution coordinated by Guyana last month. Additionally, we voted in favor of the draft resolution today, reiterating this demand for an immediate ceasefire. However, this does not mean that we forgot about the hostages still brutally held in Gaza. We must remember what happened on October 7th last year and how the current conflict in Gaza was brought about. Thus, we take note that the draft resolution today clearly reiterates the GA's demand for the release of all hostages. Having said that, the Republic of Korea would like to point out that the establishment of any new mechanisms for accountability should be scrupulously assessed within the context of the existing ones. This includes, but is not limited to, various committees, commission of inquiry, and courts with jurisdictions over the occupied Palestine territory. The Republic of Korea also voted in favor of the resolution to support the mandate of UNRWA. We believe that the continued operation of UNRWA is crucial, not only to support the humanitarian efforts in Gaza, but also to provide millions of Palestinian refugees in the OPT and beyond with the basic services, including education and health care. As such, we call on all key stakeholders, notably Israel, to seriously consider the possible consequences of suspending or obstructing the mandate of UNRWA, which may exacerbate the security in the region. With regard to the resolution on UNRWA adopted today, the Republic of Korea would like to clarify our view that this resolution does not include any new budgetary implications or financial commitments beyond the scope of what has been previously discussed in the 5th Committee and approved by the GA. The Republic of Korea, as one of the members of the Security Council, will constructively participate in all efforts to restore peace and stability in the Middle East. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Republic of Korea. I give the floor to Austria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Austria voted in favor of draft resolution L33 entitled Demand for a Ceasefire in Gaza and abstained on draft resolution L32 entitled Support for the Mandate of UNRWA. Permit me to explain our reasoning. The barbaric terror attack of Hamas against Israel 14 months ago, which we condemned in the strongest possible terms, brought a new dimension of devastation to the region. Israelis are traumatized by the slaughter, torture, and sexual violence of October 7th of last year. Over 100 hostages are still held captive by Hamas terrorists, including an Austrian father of 2. In Gaza, the civilian population is facing starvation and disease in which can only be described a humanitarian catastrophe. The destruction and devastation in Gaza has reached unacceptable levels, with too many civilian lives lost already. International humanitarian law is non-negotiable. It applies all the time, everywhere. The protection of civilians is paramount. We therefore simply need an urgent ceasefire in Gaza to achieve the release of all remaining hostages and scale up the delivery of humanitarian assistance throughout Gaza. Draft Resolution L33 on a ceasefire in Gaza links the demand for a ceasefire respected by all parties to the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, and also calls for the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2735 on a ceasefire and release of hostages, which we fully support. We also recognize and support the efforts by regional partners and the United States in this regard. For these reasons, we voted yes on Draft Resolution L33. With a view to Resolution L32 on UNRWA, Austria is deeply concerned about recent developments surrounding the agency, including the Israeli legislation adopted by the Knesset on 28 October. Effectively halting the vital work of UNRWA in Gaza and the West Bank will not add to Israel's security and stability, but instead have long-lasting and probably devastating consequences for the humanitarian situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. At the same time, the agency must also continue on its path for reforms. We closely studied the report and findings of the independent review group chaired by former Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna, set up after the allegations that UNRWA staff members were involved in Hamas terror attack on Israel last year. We welcome the commitment of the Secretary General and the agency's leadership to fully implement these recommendations. And we welcome that the resolution adopted today clearly calls on UNRWA to fully implement the high-level action plan developed by the agency as a follow-up to the recommendations. We will continue to closely monitor the implementation of the action plan together with our international partners. Many of these elements are reflected in the draft resolution adopted today. However, we would have wished to see an even stronger focus on the need for reform of the organization. For the sake of its own credibility, the UN must simply be beyond reproach. Finally, the text does not address the misuse of UNRWA premises by Hamas and other terrorist groups for military purposes. For these reasons, Austria abstained on this resolution. Two short final points, colleagues. First, Austrian development cooperation continues to strive within the framework of bilateral and multilateral cooperation with partners such as UNRWA to improve the situation of the Palestinians. Since 7 October 2023, Austria has provided 53 million euros in humanitarian aid for the civilian population in Gaza and the conflict-ridden region, including 3.4 million for UNRWA. And second, as always, let me underline that Austria reconfirms its commitment to a negotiated two-state solution and to a viable Palestinian state, living side by side in peace and security with Israel, with Gaza being an integral part of the future Palestinian state. Thank you.
I thank Austria. I give the floor to Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, la Suisse a voté en faveur des deux résolutions. Ceci est l'expression de sa grande préoccupation face à la souffrance des civils au Proche-Orient, de l'importance que la Suisse accorde au respect du droit international et de son ferme soutien au rôle central de l'ONU pour la paix, la stabilité et l'aide humanitaire dans la région. Le conflit au Proche-Orient, en particulier la situation humanitaire catastrophique dans la bande de Gaza, nécessite notre action urgente, aussi celle du Conseil de sécurité. En tant que membre élu du Conseil, la Suisse a dès lors activement contribué au projet de résolution considéré par le Conseil en novembre et voté en faveur de ce dernier. Nous considérons qu'aucun membre du Conseil aurait dû voter contre un projet tel que celui présenté collectivement par les 10 membres élus. Malheureusement, il ne s'agit pas du premier veto depuis les actes de terror du 7 octobre 2023 que nous avons fermement condamnés. La Suisse s'engage depuis longtemps pour un usage restrictif du veto au Conseil de sécurité. Nous rappelons le code de conduite proposé par le groupe ACT relatif à son utilisation, soutenu par plus de 2/3 des membres de cette Assemblée à ce jour. Malgré ce veto, nous avons la responsabilité de continuer à accorder toute notre attention à la résolution de ce conflit dévastateur. La Suisse rappelle que le droit international, y inclut le droit international humanitaire et les droits de l'homme, lie les parties indépendamment de toute résolution. Les parties doivent respecter leurs obligations en toutes circonstances. Par ailleurs, la Suisse partage la forte préoccupation exprimée par l'Assemblée générale aujourd'hui quant aux 2 lois adoptées par la Knesset à l'encontre de l'UNRWA le 28 octobre dernier. Celles-ci sont en grande partie incompatibles avec le droit international. L'UNRWA est actuellement le plus grand acteur humanitaire à Gaza et fournit des services vitaux à plus de 2000 personnes. La Suisse attend d'Israël qu'il respecte ses obligations en vertu du droit international, y inclus de la Charte des Nations Unies et du droit international humanitaire. Elle rappelle qu'en tant que puissance occupante, Israël a le devoir d'assurer que les besoins essentiels de la population dans le territoire palestinien occupé soient satisfaits. L'UNRWA fait l'objet d'un grand scepticisme en Suisse suite aux reproches d'implication de certaines de ses employés dans les actes de terror perpétrés par le Hamas le 7 octobre 2023. Aussi, notre soutien à la résolution sur l'UNRWA reflète notre appel continu à l'agence de poursuivre ses efforts de réforme et mettre pleinement en œuvre les recommandations issues du rapport Colonna. Toute allégation de violation de la neutralité de l'UNRWA doit faire l'objet d'un suivi et des mesures adéquates. L'efficacité avec laquelle les défis constatés seront adressés sera déterminante pour l'avenir de l'organisation. Concernant l'appel de la résolution à augmenter les contributions volontaires à l'UNRWA, la Suisse souligne que toute décision sur le soutien suisse est sujette à l'approbation de son Parlement. Monsieur le Président, devant tant de souffrances, les mots commencent à nous faire défaut. Que dire, sinon que nous devons agir et défendre, ensemble, les valeurs et les principes fondateurs de notre ordre international. L'humanité doit prévaloir. Que dire, sinon que la situation nous est connue? Nous la répétons, un cessez-le-feu immédiat et permanent, la libération immédiate et inconditionnelle des otages et le respect du droit international y inclut la protection des civils et l'acheminement sûr, rapide et sans entrave de l'aide humanitaire, et ce, dès maintenant. Nous devons urgemment relancer les perspectives de paix fondées sur la solution à 2 États afin de permettre aux Israéliens et aux Palestiniens de vivre en paix, en sécurité et en dignité. Il est grand temps d'agir en ce sens. Je vous remercie.
I thank Switzerland. I give the floor to Romania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Romania voted in favor of the 2 resolutions adopted earlier today, as my delegation is a strong believer in using all diplomatic resorts, including UN avenues, to achieve the long-standing political objective, 2-state solution. This remains the only way for bringing just and lasting peace in the Middle East, with the State of Israel and an independent, democratic, contiguous, sovereign, and viable State of Palestine living side by side in peace and security and mutual recognition. However, Romania would have preferred a strong condemnation in the text of the horrific Hamas attacks of October 7, 2023, which resulted not only in hundreds of dead Israeli civilians, but also hostages for whose lives we fear. We cannot but repeat the need for the hostages to be released immediately and unconditionally. The humanitarian situation in Gaza has reached a low point that could not be imagined 15 months ago. We pay tribute to all UN agencies and member states, including my own, that contribute for the benefit of the civilians in Gaza. UNRWA remains a key instrument in responding to the needs of the Palestine refugees in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, West Bank, and Gaza. We welcome the measures taken to implement the recommendations of the Colonna report on UNRWA activities. This is the kind of scrutiny that needs to monitor the intended mandate given by this General Assembly to UNRWA in actually December 1949. And I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Romania. I give the floor to Sweden.
Sweden remains committed to a just and comprehensive resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with the State of Israel and an independent, democratic, contiguous, sovereign and viable State of Palestine living side by side in peace and security and mutual recognition, with Jerusalem as a future capital of both states in accordance accordance with the relevant resolutions of the UN Security Council. Sweden shares the deep concern expressed over the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza and the immense suffering of the civilian population. We reiterate our condemnation of the abhorrent terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on October 7th last year. All remaining hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. International law, including international humanitarian law, must be respected by all parties. There is an urgent need for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza in line with Security Council Resolution 2735. Sweden fully supports the diplomatic efforts to this end. We are deeply concerned by the recent legislation on UNRWA adopted by Israel and urge Israeli authorities to ensure continued humanitarian access to the many civilians who depend on UN services. We expect that UNRWA, like other UN agencies, is respected and protected in line with international obligations. We reiterate that the legislation, if implemented, may violate Israel's obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and the legally binding provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice. We welcome the call on all parties to ensure respect for the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence for the provision of humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, Sweden voted in favor of the resolution on ceasefire in Gaza, as well as the resolution on support for the mandate of UNRWA today. Nonetheless, Sweden would like to clarify its position related to the UNRWA resolution, notably operative paragraph 7 and 31. The text of the resolution is in certain aspects more far-reaching than what has previously been agreed by this Assembly. Sweden would have preferred a more balanced approach, highlighting the crucial role of UNRWA, as well as the need for necessary measures to safeguard the UN's ability to find sustainable solutions to ensure the continued delivery of humanitarian aid to Palestine refugees. Finally, we would like to thank the UN humanitarian staff for the tireless work on the ground, often at the risk of their lives. We deeply regret the deaths of UN humanitarian workers and express our heartfelt condolences to their families. Thank you.
I thank Sweden. I give the floor to the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank you for convening today's emergency special session. I have the honor to deliver this explanation of vote on the resolution on the demand for ceasefire in Gaza and the resolution on UNRWA on behalf of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Mr. President, it has been more than a year since the atrocious attacks by Hamas on 7 October 2023, and to our grave concern, the prospects remain bleak. The conflict that unfolded after the attacks is still ongoing. The fate of many of the hostages is still uncertain, and the suffering of the people in Gaza is worsening every day. A year has passed, and still more than 100 people are held hostage. And for more than 400 days, their families have been living in the greatest fear for their loved ones. In this light, the Kingdom of the Netherlands reiterates that the end of this horrific war must be linked to the release of these hostages. We call for an immediate ceasefire, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, and the unimpeded delivery of sufficient humanitarian aid to those in need. Concerns about UNRWA should be addressed, and recommendations on the neutrality of UNRWA from the Colonna report need to be implemented. Nonetheless, restricting the work of UNRWA in a time of unprecedented humanitarian needs will negatively impact the already worrying situation in the region, and especially in Gaza. We urge Israel to carefully consider its international obligations and the impact on the ground before taking further action. The ban on UNRWA poses a concern for the ability to deliver humanitarian aid to people in need in Gaza. Therefore, the Netherlands supports most of what is stated in the resolution tabled here today on UNRWA. Nevertheless, at this moment, the continuity of humanitarian aid delivery is too reliant on the implementing capacity of one organization. And while supporting the mandate of UNRWA in providing basic services in the region and thereby contributing to stability, we therefore abstained from voting. The Netherlands will continue to provide humanitarian assistance through various channels, and we support support efforts to further diversify the humanitarian landscape in Gaza to better guarantee that humanitarian aid can reach those in need. Today, we also reaffirm our long-standing commitment to pursuing accountability for international crimes and other violations of international law committed by any of the parties of the conflict. We strongly believe that pushing for justice promotes a shared sense of hope, commitment, and duty. The Kingdom of the Netherlands welcomes the request to the Secretary General to present proposals on how the United Nations could help advance accountability and underlines the importance that existing and possible new mechanisms should reinforce and complement each other. The Kingdom of the Netherlands has therefore voted in favor of the resolution on the ceasefire in Gaza in front of us today and abstained on the UNRWA resolution. I thank you very much.
I thank the Kingdom of the Netherlands. I give the floor to Liechtenstein.
Mr. President, Liechtenstein has voted in favor of Resolution ES 10/25, just adopted, entitled Support for the Mandate of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. We note that much of this text is similar to that of Resolution 78/73, adopted last year with overwhelming support of the membership, including our own. We note, furthermore, that additions to the text reflect the vastly deteriorated situation in Gaza and the need to ensure the full implementation of the recommendations of the Colonna report, including through the necessary funding, which is essential for the effective continued operation of UNRWA with full respect for the principle of neutrality. Liechtenstein reiterates, as the Security Council has, and as this resolution does, that UNRWA remains the backbone of all humanitarian response in Gaza and that no organization can replace or substitute UNRWA's capacity and mandate to serve Palestine refugees and civilians in urgent need of life-saving humanitarian assistance. Our vote in favor of this resolution is a vote to support UNRWA's efforts to meet the needs of Palestinian civilians and to meet the high standards of governance that we expect from it. To this end, we also continue to support the Statement of Shared Commitments on UNRWA proposed by Kuwait, Jordan, and Slovenia. I thank you.
I thank Liechtenstein. I give the floor to Iraq.
السيد الرئيس، صوت العراق لصالح القرار A/ES10/L33 انطلاقا من حرصه في التعبير عن موقفه الثابت تجاه القضية الفلسطينية العادلة ودعم جميع الجهود الدولية الرامية إلى وضع حد للعدوان والانتهاكات الجسيمة الممنهجة التي تقوم بها سلطة قوات الاحتلال، ومنها الوقف الفوري غير المشروط لإطلاق النار وتيسير وصول المساعدات الإنسانية. إلا أنه يعلن تحفظه عما ورد في منطوق الفقرة العاملة 8 من القرار المذكور، كون مضامينها تتعارض وتخالف التشريعات الوطنية وموقف العراق المبدئي تجاه القضية الفلسطينية. ويرى العراق ضرورة تدخل المجتمع الدولي لإيقاف الممارسات التي تقوم بها سلطة الكيان الإسرائيلي التي تعد مخالفة صارخة وممنهجة وصريحة لمبادئ القانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة واتفاقيات جنيف ذات الصلة بالقانون الدولي الإنساني. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
I thank Iraq. If you could just give us a few moments to clear this out. Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished observer of the Observer State of Palestine on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. President. Actually, it is not a point of order. It is a general statement after the end of the voting and the explanation of votes. And if you allow me, I'd like to proceed.
Excellency, you may continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, my delegation, the delegation of the State of Palestine to the United Nations would like to express our gratitude and thanks to the overwhelming support and voting in favor of the two resolutions, the one demanding an immediate and unconditional ceasefire against our people in the occupied land of the State of Palestine, particularly in the Gaza Strip, and also the resolution defending UNRWA and on the basis of its mandate stemming from the General Assembly. What we need is an immediate ceasefire, unconditional, and what we need is UNRWA to be able to carry out the humanitarian assistance needed to our people in Gaza, including the northern part of Gaza. As I said, we are grateful and thankful to this overwhelming support. It's almost unanimous vote on these two resolutions. This reflects the resolve and the determination of the international community as we see it reflected in this very important chamber, the General Assembly, which is the highest authority in the UN system. And also we are grateful for the introduction of the two resolutions, the introduction by Ireland regarding the resolution on UNRWA and Indonesia regarding the resolution demanding an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. And we agree with the articulation of the minister from Indonesia, my brother Tata, when he said, had we implemented a resolution last December in which the number of casualties among the Palestinian people were in the vicinity of 20,000, and the number of casualties today is in the vicinity of 50,000, and of course the number of injuries tens of thousands more than a year ago. We could have saved the lives of all those that, because the United Nations, and more specifically the Security Council and the abuse of the veto, dragged its feet not to allow the position of the international community then last December by 153 votes, and today by 158 votes, although the resolution of today is much more powerful and clearer and stronger than the resolution of a year ago. Of all these things, they give us a strong feeling of the position of the General Assembly knocking on the door of the Security Council and saying that it is high time for you to implement your resolutions, and the feeling of the General Assembly, and to do that through using Chapter 7 of the Charter of the United Nations. We will keep knocking on the doors of the Security Council and the General Assembly until we see an immediate and unconditional ceasefire put in place, and until we see humanitarian assistance seeing and being distributed at scale in all corners of the Gaza Strip. And in this regard, as many of you, almost all of you, who spoke and voted in favor indicated that UNRWA is indispensable, UNRWA cannot be replaced, and UNRWA is capable of carrying the position of the international community with regard of providing humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people everywhere. I don't want, to keep you any longer. I know that we had a very long day in the morning and in the afternoon, and very strong statements of support by all those who participated in the debate, by all of those who participated in the voting. We thank you very much again, and we will most likely see you soon when we give our support to the effort of our friendly country, Norway, when they come to the General Assembly asking for action on a resolution that they are putting before all of us, seeking advisory opinion from the ICJ on issues related to the situation in Palestine. And I thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished observer of the Observer State of Palestine. We have heard the last speaker for this meeting. In accordance with the terms of paragraph 11 of Resolution ES-10/26 of the 11th of December 2024, the 10th Emergency Special Session of the Assembly is temporarily adjourned. The meeting is adjourned.